It started with a single question, not a stack of secret files, not a classified briefing room full of intelligence officers, just one calm, deliberate question asked at exactly the right moment. 6 months earlier, the confrontation had already begun. Inside the House Judiciary Committee hearing room, cameras were pointed toward the witness table where FBI Director Kash Patel sat answering questions from lawmakers. The atmosphere was tense but predictable. Members from both parties were taking their turns asking about investigations, budgets, and national security issues. Then Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas was recognized to speak. Anyone who had followed congressional hearings before knew that Crockett rarely wasted her time with small talk. Before entering Congress, she had spent years as a criminal defense attorney in Dallas. Her career had been built in courtrooms where the smallest detail could expose a lie, and that experience showed. 6 months earlier, she had already challenged Patel directly during another hearing. With the microphones live and every camera focused on them, she told him something that echoed across cable news. That night, she said he might be the least qualified FBI director the Bureau had ever seen. The moment spread quickly online. Clips of the exchange were everywhere. But today felt different. This time, she wasn't walking into the room with criticism or political commentary. She arrived with something far more powerful. A subpoena. The committee had voted the day before, 24 votes to 19, to authorize a request for specific records connected to Patel's personal phone activity. The vote itself had already caused a stir on Capitol Hill, but almost no one in that hearing room seemed to understand what Crockett planned to do with it. When the session began, everything looked routine. Republican members praised Patel's leadership. Questions focused on counterterrorism operations, arrest statistics, and the agency's ongoing investigations. Patel appeared relaxed, answering confidently, and occasionally leaning back in his bar chair, and he looked like a man who believed the hardest questions were already behind him. For nearly an hour, the hearing moved along exactly as expected. Then the chairman recognized Jasmine Crockett for 5 minutes. The room grew quieter, not dramatically, just enough that people started paying closer attention. Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her and placed 2 items on the desk. One was a copy of the subpoena authorization approved the previous day. The other was a single sheet of paper turned face down. Patel noticed it immediately. At first, Crockett asked a simple question. "Director Patel," she said calmly, "are you aware that this committee authorized a subpoena yesterday related to your personal phone records?" Patel nodded slightly. "Yes, Congresswoman. My legal team is currently reviewing the committee's request." Crockett gave a small smile. "I'm sure they are." And then she turned the paper over, and that was the moment everything in the room changed. Because whatever was written on that page, Patel clearly did not expect to see it. When Jasmine Crockett flipped the paper over, she didn't lift it for the cameras. She didn't read from it dramatically. She simply left it on the table where everyone could see that it existed. Then she looked directly at the FBI director. "Director Patel," she said, her voice steady and measured, "I want to ask you about a specific phone call." The words themselves sounded simple, but the way she said them made several people in the room shift slightly in their seats. Because this didn't sound like speculation. It sounded like she already knew something. Patel kept his expression neutral. "As you know, Congresswoman," he replied, "I make a large number of calls in the course of my duties as director." Crockett nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said. "That's exactly why I want to focus on one particular call." She glanced briefly down at the paper. Then she read a single line. "February 33rd, 10:47 p.m. The room went still. "Are you familiar with the phone call you made at that time from your personal cell phone?" For a moment, nothing happened. Patel didn't immediately answer. Not long enough to be dramatic, but just long enough that several reporters sitting along the wall began typing notes. Finally, he spoke. "Congresswoman, I cannot confirm the details of individual communications in an open hearing." Crockett tilted her head slightly. "That's interesting," she said. She paused for a moment before continuing. "Let me approach the question another way." The paper on the desk still faced upward. Cameras could see its outline, but not the text. Crockett tapped it lightly with her finger. "Director Patel," she said, "are you familiar with the law firm Kasowitz Benson Torres?" Something changed in Patel's posture. Not dramatically, but enough. His chair shifted slightly backward across the floor with a quiet scrape that microphones barely picked up. Several heads in the room turned. Patel cleared his throat. Congresswoman, the FBI communicates with many legal representatives in the course of federal investigations. Crockett nodded again. That's true. Then she delivered the line that made several people in the room suddenly stop writing. That firm represents Donald Trump. The sentence hung in the air. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone of anything. She simply continued. According to records this committee is obtained through a separate process, Crockett said. A call from your personal phone connected to that firm at 10:47 p.m. on February 23rd. She paused for exactly 2 seconds. That call lasted 17 minutes. At the back of the room, a Capitol Police officer near the doorway shifted his stance slightly. Another officer near the wall rested a hand near her radio. No one spoke. Crockett leaned slightly toward the microphone. And 3 weeks later, she said calmly, dozens of documents related to the Epstein investigation were suddenly reclassified and removed from the public release schedule. She looked up, right at Patel. So my question is very simple. She slid the subpoena authorization forward on the desk. This committee voted yesterday to obtain your call logs and message records for the period covering that date. She paused again, then asked the question that would define the entire hearing. What exactly did you discuss during that phone call? This silence that followed felt longer than it actually was, but in congressional hearings, even a few seconds can feel like an eternity. Patel didn't speak. Not immediately, and every camera in the room was now pointed directly at him. For a moment the room felt frozen. The question had been asked clearly. There was no confusion about what Crockett wanted to know. Everyone was watching the FBI Director. Kash Patel didn't react the way many people expected. His face didn't change dramatically. There was no sudden outburst, no raised voice. Instead, something else happened. His expression became completely still. Reporters who had followed months of hearings with Patel had learned to read his small reactions. The slight tightening of his jaw, the quick glance toward his legal team, the subtle shift in his shoulders when he prepared to answer a difficult question. But this time, none of those signals appeared. He simply sat there, looking directly at Crockett. Finally, he spoke. Congresswoman, he said carefully, any communications I may have had with legal representatives would be protected by attorney-client privilege. A quiet murmur moved through the audience seats behind the committee members. Crockett didn't interrupt. She let him finish. And therefore I cannot discuss the substance of those communications in an open congressional hearing. For a brief moment, it sounded like a standard legal response. But Crockett had already anticipated it. She leaned forward slightly. Director Patel, she said calmly, you are not the client of that law firm. The room grew quiet again. Donald Trump is. She allowed the words to settle before continuing. So the privilege you're referring to doesn't belong to you. Several members of the committee looked up from their notes. Crockett's voice remained controlled, almost conversational. You are the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, she said. You are not Donald Trump's private attorney. Patel's lead counsel suddenly rose from his chair behind the witness table. Mr. Chairman, the attorney said quickly, I must object to this line of questioning. Before he could finish, the chairman's voice cut across the room. Counselor, your client is the witness, he said firmly. Please sit down. The attorney hesitated, then slowly returned to his seat. All eyes turned back to Patel. Crockett picked up the subpoena authorization again and held it briefly in the air. This committee voted yesterday to compel production of your phone records, she said. Those records will include call logs, message data, and encrypted communications covering the exact time period we're discussing. She set the document back on the table. The compliance deadline is 14 days. The implication was clear. Sooner or later, the information would appear. Crockett leaned forward just slightly. So I'll ask again, she said. What was discussed during that 17-minute phone call? The room fell silent. 1 second passed, and then another. At the entrance to the chamber, a Capitol Police officer took 2 slow steps forward, reacting to the sudden tension in the room. Patel placed both hands flat on the table. He looked straight ahead, and he said nothing. 7 seconds passed. In everyday conversation, 7 seconds is barely noticeable. In a congressional hearing broadcast live across the country, it feels endless. Reporters stopped typing. Several lawmakers leaned forward in their chairs. Even the low hum of movement in the room seemed to disappear. Kash Patel still hadn't spoken. His hands remained pressed flat against the table. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, focused somewhere between Crockett and the microphone. Finally, his lead attorney stood again. "Mr. Chairman," he said quickly, "we object to this questioning on the grounds that it involves privileged communications connected to legal counsel." Before the sentence was finished, the chairman responded, "Counselor," he said firmly, "the witness may answer the question or decline to answer." The attorney opened his mouth as if to continue arguing, but he stopped. The room returned to silence. Crockett hadn't moved. She watched Patel carefully, the way a trial lawyer watches a witness who is deciding how much to reveal. Then she spoke again, slowly. "Director Patel," she said, "the American public deserves transparency." Her tone wasn't angry. If anything, it sounded almost clinical. "You told this committee 6 months ago that the FBI would not allow political influence to affect its investigations." She glanced down briefly at the paper in front of her. "And now we have evidence that a 17-minute call took place between your personal phone and a law firm representing a political figure whose legal matters intersect with federal investigations." Another pause. Crockett's next sentence landed harder than the others. "And shortly after that call, multiple documents related to the Epstein investigation were removed from public release. Several cameras zoomed closer. Patel finally inhaled slowly. It looked like he was about to answer, but instead, he simply repeated the same statement. "As I said, Congresswoman, I cannot discuss communications that may involve legal counsel." The wording was careful, extremely careful. He still wasn't confirming the call directly. Crockett noticed that too. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "Understood," she said. Then she turned toward the rest of the committee room. "Let the record reflect," she said clearly, "that the director of the FBI has declined to answer a direct question regarding communication with the legal representatives of a sitting president." The statement echoed through the chamber. Patel's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. Crockett gathered her papers calmly. Before lowering the microphone, she added one final sentence. "I will look forward to reviewing those phone records when they arrive." Then she sat back. Her 5 minutes had ended, but the impact of those 5 minutes was only beginning. The hearing technically continued. Other members asked questions about budgets, staffing, and national security operations. The chairman moved the discussion forward, as if nothing unusual had happened, but everyone in the room knew something had shifted. The moment had already escaped the chamber. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating across social media platforms and cable news networks. The short video showed the exact sequence that had just unfolded. Crockett turning over the paper, the question about the late-night phone call, Patel's still expression, and the long silence that followed. Political commentators immediately began debating what it meant. Some argued the exchange proved nothing. Others said the silence itself raised serious questions. Legal analysts focused on a different detail. Patel had attempted to invoke attorney-client privilege, but the law firm mentioned during the hearing represented Donald Trump, not the FBI director himself. Under traditional legal standards, the privilege belongs to the client, not to someone who merely contacted the attorney. That distinction quickly became the center of the discussion, because if the privilege did not apply, the committee's subpoena for phone records could still move forward, and the timeline was already clear. The subpoena authorized by the committee required Patel's records for a specific window of time, from late January through mid-March. The compliance deadline was 14 days. That meant the clock had already started. Somewhere inside the committee offices on Capitol Hill, staff members were now preparing for what would happen next. If the records were delivered, they would show the exact details surrounding the call Crockett had described, the time, the duration, possibly even encrypted messages connected to it. And Jasmine Crockett had made one thing clear before leaving the microphone. She planned to be there when those records arrived. By the time the hearing ended and the gavel finally came down, the video had already spread far beyond Washington. Millions of people had watched the same moment. The quiet scrape of a chair moving back from the table, a question about one specific phone call, and 11 seconds of silence from the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sometimes investigations begin with mountains of documents. Sometimes they begin with secret recordings. But sometimes all it takes is a single question asked at exactly the right time, and now the entire country was waiting to see what those phone records would reveal.